Internet, what's shaking? So let's look at the market of Philadelphia, see if we can determine where the housing market possibly goes from here. So, what I'm going to do, like I have in videos in the past, I'll just limit the visuals to the labor data, but I will talk about really all the factors that play into what would influence maybe home prices rising, remaining steady, or even falling. But I think, as with really any market in the United States, it's really just a matter of time before we see outright price declines, even in a place like Philadelphia, which right now has uh, something like inventory or active listings for sale is still quite low, but remember, like, there are a lot of local dynamics that can keep something like that subdued, despite the fact that, from a structural standpoint, it is at or near like peak homes per capita, really all over this MSA. Uh, and I've mentioned that several times before. I mean, there's no market that's really immune from, we'll call it, 40 years of falling long in rates. And people just don't like to hear that, but that's the reality of the situation. So, look, I'll talk about the housing stock, households, the actual sales data, as I just sort of alluded to. What are rents doing, permitting, mortgages, all of it, so we can get a feel for it. And Phil, Dr. Phil, this one's for you. I know you had mentioned that you were interested in this market, particularly King of Prussia, which is a very small area, but I'll do my best to try and hit on that as well. Because, yes, you can observe a lot of this information, even in a census designated place like that only has a population of 25,000 people, give or take. So, okay, where I like to start, and I'll end with the labor data because that kind of rounds it out, is I like to start with really the demographic backdrop. And so, like, really the population. What is it doing in Philadelphia, Montgomery County, even, which is where King of Prussia is? And even more specifically, King of Prussia. I mean, look, the population is growing, but it's being exclusively driven by international migration, and it is extremely outsized from a historical standpoint. This market is maybe just a tad older. Like, if you look at the share of individuals over the age of 55 years old, it's, I believe, just north of 30%, and 30% is the national average. Now, Montgomery County is closer to the national, I believe it's closer to the national average. King of Prussia is right there at the median age. So, that being said, I bring that up because right then and there, there are some implications downstream, especially in the fact that we've had all this really outsized international migration as really the driver of population change is very, very unusual. And the fact that we're not really growing just in a very healthy way. I mean, birth rates are down all over the place, including this market. No different really than the national trend. And so that creates really instability within households, and it especially does when you're really sort of at full employment, meaning like this market, just like every single other market, also has dual income households. Yes, you can observe that at a very local level, no different here. But then we also have these like non-family household growth dynamics, which are typically, it's like one person maybe living alone. It could be like, say, a young renter living alone, uh, and those are usually the most vulnerable group because they haven't had time to accumulate assets and typically make less. Or maybe it's like an old widower living off of fixed income, what have you. So there are all of these really weak links in every single market, and those are really some common themes. It's just really the rate of change and some of these local dynamics that determine how and when that will play out. So uh, now, if I'm thinking about King of Prussia, incomes, Montgomery County, it's a bit of a more affluent area. I mean, household incomes are like in the low 100s, and that's obviously higher than you see at a national level. I would say King of Prussia is just a tad more affluent than even Montgomery County, but that's sort of an arbitrary comparison. You're talking about an area of like 25,000 people, which, yes, the population is growing, getting older, compared to Montgomery County, which has, again, it's that same trend, growing population, a lot of international migration, but then it's just getting older as well. So now I will say, sort of downstream from the area being more affluent, things like rents to incomes and DTIs just look a tad better. It's especially obvious on the mortgage households. Uh, like at a national level, anytime I see more than like 30% of homeowners paying 30% plus of their income towards, like home ownership cost monthly, that's typically a bad sign. It's a little bit less than that here in King of Prussia as well as Montgomery County. Again, back to the affluence. But on the renter side, they really haven't caught a break. It looks pretty much in line with the national figures, which roughly half of renters pay 30% plus of their income towards rent. So that being said, that only makes sense. I mean, uh, you, now when you look at something like DTIs, like I said, everything is trending in the wrong direction. It is still very unaffordable for you know um, locals here. You're talking about DTIs in the range of 40% now, which is basically put in a double top. You compare it to GFC. I mean, we have literally round tripped when it comes to that measure. And so it only makes sense that you're starting to see even the delinquencies and things of that nature pick up. So it just kind of is what it is. Now, from a structural standpoint, if I were to look at something or a place like King of Prussia, it has really I would say over the past 5 years in particular, really the home ownership rate has plummeted there. And look, that is partly why homes per capita is near its all-time highs, but it's not entirely for that reason. I mean, like, and I don't really care how much like an area is building. I mean, you're basically people who look at really housing from just like a permitting or a building standpoint, or are ignoring basically the majority of the pie. Okay, so like inventory for sale or permitting, I mean, you're talking about maybe 1%, 1 or 2% of the entire housing stock, right? At any given time. Like if you were to think about permitting annually or whatever, like the balance of inventory for sale is. I mean, literally 1 or 2% of the entire housing stock. So you're not really capturing anything when sort of looking at that measure. So that being said, it's really you have to take something like inventory for sale being low right now with a grain of salt, because you need to factor in really the housing stock, who lives in the homes themselves, what's their financial situation, all the things that I've essentially just mentioned, and also even the size of the households. Which another thing you see with, generally speaking, more affluent and or older households is they're just smaller. So if they're smaller in size, that just means fewer potential incomes per home, because they are, say, able to afford that apartment. And if there would be a weak link kind of back to how the home ownership rate has really fallen in a place like King of Prussia as compared to, say, Montgomery County, which still remains a strong home ownership market, it would be in something like those renters. I mean, it looks like there's a lot of multifamily that's hit that market. So I would pay attention to that, because you have seen, again, young renter household growth really these past several years there. No different than the national trend in that regard. So it'll show now in terms of rents, effective rents, asking rents, and all that. Yes, I mean, rents lead home prices. So yes, home prices are still elevated in a place like King of Prussia. I mean, that only makes sense with inventory being low. But you're now seeing like asking and effective rents really slow. I mean, they're, depending on which data set you look at, it's like sub 2% year over year now. And I expect it to really roll over, and then you'll start to see as inventory for sale picks up, that will start to make its way into home prices. So let's see. Yeah, okay. Permitting, I sort of hit on that a little bit. What I would say there is that, I mean, yes, you guys haven't built, say, as much as you did like pre GFC, but again, homes accumulate in an area. Uh, there and back to something like inventory for sale being low. I mean, you can have all these factors that influence mobility, such as like the share of homeowners without a mortgage, even the age of the homeowners, um, like the type of whether it's renting or owning household it is it family, is it not non-family, uh, maybe it's a renter, is it like, is this a single family rental or is it multifamily? All those things influence it. But that, in addition to investor activity, if you were to think about something like inventory for sale in a market where they're just relatively less mobile, say, as you would see in Montgomery County, you can have a scenario where people stay put, you have investor activity, and there's a bottlenecking that takes place in addition to all this COVID stimulus, where something like inventory for sale does get really low, but now it's sort of put it in a bottom and it's moving higher. So it's just on a delay. If you were to say compare it to really a lot of the Sunbelt markets that are showing their true colors, and now it's the West Coast, and now it's these other markets that are starting to like see inventory go up, and it's because we just have too many homes. I mean, the fact that homes per capita is really at or near all-time highs, and the, the average household size, all those things have been range bound for decades, and it's for a very good reason. The number of people can only get so small per home because that limits the number of incomes per home, and that's the last thing you need in the face of peak unaffordability and in a softening labor market. So this whole thing is just unwinding. Um, okay, now that I've hit on that, let's talk about the labor situation, which is rather unique. I would say it's more on the extreme end when if you were to just think of something like healthcare and government really accounting for the bulk of job growth, which is also why the unemployment rate is still relatively low. Uh, but there are some very interesting things going on in this healthcare bucket. But before I get to that, let me just explain this setup, what we're looking at here. This is, again, it's just the labor data. So this is this visual, it captures the two uh, data sets from the BLS, which measure local labor markets. So down here we have the unemployment rate, which comes from the local area unemployment statistics, otherwise known as LAUS. Think of the household survey. I mean, the household survey is what produces the unemployment rate. And then these other five charts are from the establishment survey. So anytime you see NFP, think establishment survey. NFP, non-farm payrolls, right? That's the thing that gets quoted month over month, seasonally adjusted at a national level. I'm not a fan of the seasonal adjustments, but uh, everything here is not seasonally adjusted. But anyway, doesn't matter. Okay, methodology differences are important between these two different series. So non-farm payrolls, or otherwise known as the establishment survey. It's an employer-facing survey, as the name suggests, so it captures where the employer is located. But look, most people live in the vicinity of where they work. Okay, just to be clear, I know people like harp on all this remote work and everything else, but they're the minority in the aggregate. And they don't make this the establishment survey. It doesn't make a distinction for multiple job holders, part time, full time, and it doesn't capture the unincorporated, self employed. So think like gig workers, just broadly speaking. Whereas the unincorporated, self employed do get captured in something like the unemployment rate. And as the name implies, with this survey, it is household facing, i.e., household survey. And there's some other differences too, but I'll just kind of leave it there. This is also like just one person, one job, but there are various different cuts of the labor data. The other thing too is like I'm showing up here these charts that have the same color. The legend for all four is right here. What I'm showing is really the NFP detail rather than just like one line as I'm showing here. That's like when you think of headline NFP, that's what I'm trying to convey here. But this gets cut by industry. So this represents the primary economic activity in which the employer is engaged in. So as I was alluding to earlier, healthcare is rather outsized in terms of job growth. I'll just use my hometown of Nashville as an example. That would be like HCA, which is a for-profit health system owner and operator. And so my point in saying that is like, let's say you're a lawyer and you work for HCA, you would fall in this category, right? Okay. So it's not just clinical people, or it's not just doctors. And in fact, if you look at something like occupation employment wage statistics, what you'll see for a place like Philadelphia is, in fact, this is like a lot of allied health individuals. So think like nurses, like everything, like from a clinical standpoint, everything below like really the doctor level ish. And that's been like a pretty popular investing theme. So that shows up in home health. It shows up even behavioral health models, depending on what those look like. And then, of course, there's all this telehealth stuff that comes along with all of these models these days. But that's been a popular investing theme. Really, kind of, I consider that like a PPM or physician practice management like mutation in a sense, because a lot of investment has moved away from investing in like just your cookie cutter physician roll ups, because number one, people don't like to deal with doctors because they're rather arrogant. Not all of them. They're hard to work with professionally. But number two, they're just expensive. And so if you can like figure out a way to have like maybe somebody who's like a certified uh, allied health professional, they're just going to be cheaper to employ. And so if you can work out a scenario where there's like a ratio of maybe one MD to 10 therapists or whatever it may be, that is what I mean by these sort of PPM mutations. I mean, autism has really gotten in on the mix in terms of a lot of private equity invested in that space, but private equity is invested in just about everything these days. So, look, that's a long winded way of saying there are some popular investing themes, but there's also like some secular themes, i.e., home health is probably the most obvious one here. But here's a real important distinction. There is a lot of so if I were to flesh this out, this title more, I would rather this say, but this is how it just comes out of the system. It says private education and health services, but it really to really encapsulate everything that falls into here. It's private education, like healthcare and social assistance. And social assistance, all these things are sort of like more or less like, you know, tied together and very closely linked to government, because if you were to think of something like CMS, not only has there been a lot of like say home health and some of those other buckets I mentioned in terms of outright employment growth, but you're also seeing like a lot of individual and family services, which is part of social assistance. So if you were to look at say single payer enrollment in a place like Philadelphia, particularly Philadelphia County, what you're going to see it is very concentrated with Medicaid enrollees. Very, very concentrated. So what I'm describing is a scenario where there's like basically a lot of welfare and social safety net related programs and employment floating around this market. And that only makes sense because, as I was alluding to earlier, you're having like a lot of like allied health professionals who are really buoying employment. That is a scenario where you're not necessarily going to see like a shit ton of like strong quality wage growth. Those are low paying jobs in general. And anytime you see very lopsided job growth, that in and of itself is a textbook recession, but now it's just on steroids because the cyclical buckets are already in a recession. That's another reason why I'm very critical of like people who punt to the unemployment rate when they're not factoring in something like gig work, or how, the fact that we have extremely outsized international migration, really post COVID. It's so far outside of historical norms, how that could potentially be influencing just this calculation mechanically. Or the fact that, I mean, there are literally, unemployment rates for these various industries, right? You get that? So this is an aggregate figure, and it's not really telling you what you think it is. Uh, Job growth is really should be the focus. And by the way, I even pulled the QCEW for this as well. It looks very similar. Okay, it just there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of healthcare job growth, but I would not characterize that as healthy job growth. This market is sick. It is very, very sick from an employment standpoint, and it is just yet to show up in something like lower home prices, although I think it will. It's just a matter of time. Even in a place like King of Prussia, albeit more affluent, relatively more affluent than really what you'll see at a national level, but even compared to some of the areas within this MSA. And by the way, they actually make a metropolitan division for this metro because it's so large. Look at Montgomery County here too. So, yeah, guys, it is what it is. I don't make the rules. Um, yeah. Anyway, I hope that was halfway helpful. Okay. Bye.